My name is Jessica, and I'm a qualified mental health counsellor and an advocate of personal transformation. The videos I create are all based on what I've personally found to be useful. I do my best to combine personal life experience with information from evidence-based sources. As a word of caution, I want to remind you that any content on my channel is not intended to replace the instructions of your own medical and mental health professionals. And if you're feeling suicidal or like you want to harm yourself, please contact your local suicide hotline as soon as possible. Now we can proceed on with the topic of this video: CPTSD and BPD, structural dissociation of the personality. First of all, I want to give you a brief overview of the symptoms of CPTSD and BPD. So, complex post-traumatic stress disorder is not specifically categorized in the DSM-5, but it is recognized by the International Classification of Diseases as a separate condition or a subcategory of PTSD, which is an anxiety disorder. The main takeaway in terms of the difference between PTSD and CPTSD is this: PTSD is generally related to a single event, while complex PTSD is more layered than that. It's related to a series of events or one prolonged event. The symptoms are as follows: reliving the trauma through flashbacks and nightmares, avoiding situations that remind the person of the trauma, dizziness or nausea when remembering the trauma, hyperarousal, which means being in a continual state of high alert, the belief that the world is a dangerous place, a loss of trust in yourself or others, difficulty sleeping or concentrating, being startled by loud noises, a negative self-view, changes in beliefs and worldviews, emotional regulation difficulties, relationship issues, detachment from the trauma, and also a preoccupation with the abuser. These symptoms can vary, and they often do change over time. One doesn't have to meet all of the criteria in order to be diagnosed, but I have to warn you, please avoid self-diagnosing, and if you're experiencing distress, have a qualified mental health professional assess you. Now on to borderline personality disorder. It is its own separate diagnosis, but it's very common for BPD to coexist with CPTSD. In order to be diagnosed with BPD, one must have a pervasive pattern of instability of interpersonal relationships, self-image, and affects, and marked impulsivity beginning by early adulthood and present in a variety of contexts, as indicated by 5 or more of the following: frantic efforts to avoid real or imagined abandonment, a pattern of unstable and intense interpersonal relationships characterized by alternating between extremes of idealization and devaluation, identity disturbance, markedly and persistently unstable self-image or sense of self, impulsivity in at least 2 areas that are potentially self-damaging, recurrent suicidal behavior, gestures or threats, or self-mutilating behavior, affective instability due to a marked reactivity of mood, for example, intense episodic dysphoria, irritability, or anxiety usually lasting a few hours and only rarely more than a few days, chronic feelings of emptiness, inappropriate intense anger or difficulty controlling anger, transient stress-related paranoid ideation, or severe dissociative symptoms. And now that you have some understanding of what CPTSD and BPD are, we can start looking into what qualifies as complex psychological trauma. This can be defined as repetitive or prolonged. It involves harm or abandonment by caregivers or other seemingly responsible adults, and it typically occurs at developmentally vulnerable times in the victim's life, so that could be early childhood or adolescence. What the research shows is that the level of dissociation or disconnection experienced by an individual is closely related to the intensity, as well as the longevity of the trauma and the betrayal of the attachment figure. So, attachment injuries and repetitive trauma can happen from a very young age and may endure through to adulthood, which ultimately impacts the development of the sufferer's brain and alters their self-perception along with how they perceive the world around them. Examples of attachment injuries include emotional, physical, or sexual abuse, but also abandonment and neglect on a physical level, an emotional level, or both. There can also be problems that occur when there's a lot of inconsistency in the parenting style of the caregivers, and this breeds a lot of anxiety and insecurity in the child. The adults that they must rely on for their own survival in the world are basically sources of distress, while also often being their only source of either real or possible comfort. What this means for those who have grown up with circumstances that match any of these descriptions is that their patterns of relationship with the self and with others, it's based on those dysfunctional interactions. The child essentially grows up having internalized those patterns, which have become part of their personality. As a vulnerable adult with these unhealthy internalized patterns, one may end up in relationships that exacerbate the symptoms and create even more layers of trauma. Now, to understand more about dissociation, I want to describe it to you as a coping mechanism that's a direct response to trauma, which creates a significant division within the personality. It's basically a disconnect between one part of the self and another. The brain offers this automatic defense to help the trauma sufferer avoid pain that they're experiencing, which gives them a kind of psychological escape. Post-traumatic issues can be placed along a spectrum. So this spectrum can range from mild to severe, and the mildest form is typically known as acute stress disorder, the most severe case manifesting as dissociative identity disorder, which some people may know as multiple personality disorder. So where does BPD and CPTSD come along the spectrum? It typically fits in the middle high range of the spectrum, and this goes along with any other trauma-related personality disorder. And what happens is that the brain then functions in a fragmented, fractured way. There'll be an aspect of the self that the trauma survivor uses for everyday functioning. And its main purpose is just to avoid anything related to trauma. This part of the self is known as the apparently normal part of the personality, or the ANP. It's what most people, including the individual themselves, would consider their usual self when they're feeling calm and stable. But please keep in mind that it's not fully integrated. It's not a holistic sense of self, and its entire existence is serving the purpose of pushing down and avoiding memories, feelings, and thoughts related to the trauma. The other aspects are called the emotional parts of the personality, or EPs, and they're activated when a trigger associated with a particular trauma engages them. So, the EP is rigid and it's fixated on the traumatic experience. When it's activated, it can cause regression to happen, so that the person who's triggered into that part is responding the same way they may have responded at the age when the original trauma happened. This is why it may be hard for the person to actually regulate their emotions in that moment, because it's very likely that they're in a psychological state of a child or an adolescent whose capacity to stop and think rationally about the situation is minimal, and it's overrun by extreme feelings and sensations associated with the traumatic experience. Those with a diagnosis of BPD alternate drastically between different parts of their personality. They experience constant mood shifts that are brought on by an interaction that they've had with the world around them. Now, this is particularly with people around them, and especially when it's people they're closely attached to. As mentioned before, dissociation is a feature of BPD, and in many ways it explains why these changes in mood, identity, and beliefs, thoughts, and life goals even happen. I thought it'd be useful to list some signs and symptoms of structural dissociation, so here they are. It can present as manifestations of internal splitting. This means that the person is functioning highly at work while regressing in therapy. They might alternate between idealizing and devaluing people that they have a strong attachment to. And this can also look like high intelligence coupled with poor judgment. Often people are perplexed, they see these highly intelligent individuals making terrible life decisions. Many people with BPD and CPTSD have a number of previous therapists and even diagnoses, but without much progress or clarity. Often the treatments have been rocky or have ended in some unusually dramatic way. There are also somatic symptoms or physical symptoms, such as unusual pain tolerance, stress-related headaches, eye scanning, blinking or drooping, nausea, dizziness, random aches and pains in the body without any medical explanation, and even non-responsiveness to medication. Now, as mentioned before, there can be regressive behavior such as body postures, cognition, verbal or body language that is basically more typical of young children, an inability to make eye contact, running away, becoming mute, or even having a limited vocabulary, fear of abandonment, or clinging emotionally. There are also patterns of indecision and self-sabotage that reflect internal struggles between the parts, and that includes an inability to make everyday decisions. It can be problems committing to significant others or frequent job or career changes. It can be having a lot of success one moment and then that alternates with failure and disability. It can be functioning very highly and then all of a sudden decompensation. Hard working in therapy but self-destructive outside of it. Some memory symptoms include difficulty remembering how time was spent in a day, difficulty maintaining continuity from therapy session to therapy session, having blackouts, getting lost while driving somewhere familiar, even forgetting conversations, forgetting well-learned skills, engaging in behaviors that they don't recall. Someone might say, "Hey, you said this to me the other day," or "You did this," and the person will not remember. And that can be quite concerning for the people around the victim. Another sign is having patterns of self-destruction and addictive behavior, and those addictive behaviors also reflect these internal conflicts. The apparently normal part of the personality may be committed to life and to stabilization, but the EPs, so the emotional parts of the personality, are engaging in high-risk behavior or may even attempt to harm or kill the body in an effort to get relief at any cost. So, to summarize, CPTSD and BPD sufferers experience distressing symptoms that typically begin at a young age due to repeated trauma or attachment injuries by seemingly responsible adults in their life, which interrupts their brain's development and their ability to regulate their emotions appropriately. They experience dissociation as a coping mechanism in response to their trauma, which fragments their personality into different parts, an apparently normal part that serves the function of trauma avoidance, and the emotional parts of the personality, which are engaged when the individual is met with a trigger related to the associated trauma. This creates a lot of internal conflict and difficulties in relationships, as well as the inability to stick to a particular job or a direction in life. And symptoms are experienced in a variety of ways that can be experienced differently from person to person. The good news is that 50% of people diagnosed with BPD tend to no longer meet the criteria for BPD after 10 years of therapeutic intervention. There is certainly hope for those determined to improve their psychological well-being and quality of life. Treatments such as dialectical behavior therapy, acceptance and commitment therapy, cognitive behavioral therapy have all been clinically proven to make a difference in the lives of those who are dedicated to healing. If you'd like to see more, please remember to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you'll be the first to watch when the next video comes out. Until next time, I want to leave you with these affirmations to repeat to yourself. May I show myself the love I deserve. May I find inner peace. May I be safe within myself.